Hello, and welcome to the Talk Stew podcast. I am your host, Don Kloss. In this podcast series, I speak on topics that are an amalgam of science, philosophy, history, religion, sociology and society, business, language, literature and the arts, even politics and beyond. I am not supported by any company, organization, or other entity. The views expressed in the series are entirely my own and from my own experience and worldview. Talk Stew is a podcast originating from Columbus, Ohio. You can send your comments to me at my email address 5254dkloss@gmail.com. We begin this, our inaugural podcast, with some talk about school days and a book. When I was in grade school here in the Columbus area, like every other student, we were taught American history every year in junior high school and high school. And like pretty much every other kid, I bought into everything that we were taught, and that is what I grew up to believe. I was very surprised, however, when I got to college and had to take a prerequisite American history course at The Ohio State University, in that the professor spent most of the semester talking to us about things that we had been taught in our public school history books that were either inaccurate or completely incorrect. For example, one of the things that he raised as an issue was that when you visit Independence Hall in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in the Great Room, there is that giant, famous painting of all of our founding fathers sitting around tables in that very room, signing the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. The professor said that basically that was a lie. He said that those men did not gather in that room all at that time to sign that document. He said that was very dangerous business, that putting your name on that document was basically signing your death warrant if the British caught you. That document spent many months being passed in secret between these men to gather all the signatures. It happened in many different places over a period of time that, if I remember right, he said was slightly over a year. And thing after thing was revealed that was not true or inaccurate. He also raised points about how things like slavery in the South leading up to the Civil War is really glossed over in the school history books, and the way in which we actually won, if you want to use that word, won this land and its resources came about. And I find out much later from my own personal research that when Europeans first landed on the Atlantic shores of this country, there were already a great many people living here. there were between what is now the United States, Canada, and Mexico nearly 53 million Native Americans. And we systematically, through the mid-1600s up through the mid to late 1800s, committed genocide against all of those races and tribes of Indians. We almost entirely wiped them out. And that is how we came to be in possession of all this land. From everything that you read in adventure books or you see in the TV westerns, the Indians were just troublemakers, very aggressive against us. And in a way they were, and rightly so. When Europeans first came here to this country, the Indians, the Native Americans, were willing to share their bounty with us. They, however, had a way of life to which we were unaccustomed. They only took from the land and the other resources what they needed to live off of. They only killed as many buffaloes as they needed for meat and for the furs, for their blankets and their clothes and so on. And they used every part of an animal. Nothing went to waste. They only cleared as much land as they needed to plant crops like maize to survive on. There was no such thing as commerce in their world. There was no such thing as surplus. There was no such thing as export and import. That was all something that was very foreign to them. But we came here and we knew all about those things, were accustomed to dealing in those things. And when we saw how much bounty there was here, what there was in the way of land and resources, we wanted it all. We wanted every bit of it, and we would stop at nothing less. So that, without going into the long story, is what brought about the aggression from the Indians, retaliation from the Europeans, counter-retaliation from the Indians over and over and over for the time period that I mentioned until we are where we are at today, which is, you pretty much have to call it the genocide of the Native Americans, and there are very, very few of them left. Not only that, but the white man continues to do harm against the Native Americans that are left. For example, one thing that I was involved in when I lived in New Jersey that was really a sad happening was that in New Jersey there were a large tribe of the Lenni Lenape Indians, which were a branch of the Delaware Indians that had historically lived along the Delaware River for about 23,000 years, it was estimated. And they, at the time I lived there, were all on a reservation on Rancocas Creek outside of Mount Holly, New Jersey, the county seat. Well, one point came and the state government told them, you are being thrown off of your reservation. we are confiscating that land. You have 30 days to vacate. Now, those people in that tribe really had nowhere to go. They ended up going north into the mountains of North Jersey, where they settled with some tribes that are a Lenni Lenape Cherokee mix, which is where they are at today. But now, shortly after this happened, the real serious insult was that the Lenni Lenape were represented by a council that was chaired by someone within state government, and they were tasked with overseeing the welfare of these people. And each tribe had a representative. As it turned out, only 2 of those representatives were actual Lenni Lenape, and the other 13 representatives were either business people or lawyers that the tribes had picked to represent them in these council meetings. Well, without any advance notice, without any publicity whatsoever, this council held a private closed-door meeting during which they, if this is even a word, ceased to recognize the Lenni Lenape as a tribe legally. So their status was yanked out from under them, and along with it, their state and federal health care benefits, education and housing benefits, benefits related to WIC and things related to support in terms of food, education grants were disallowed them, and ones that they already had were canceled. So it was like a final slap in the face, and it actually broke a treaty that the Lenni Lenape had signed with President Jackson way back in 1836. So this is just very typical of what was done. And, where I am going with this is I, later on, after learning all these things in college about things we had been mistaught in school about the founding of our country, a great deal of it also had to do with the U.S. Constitution and the amendments. And I happened upon this book called Corwin and Palatson's Understanding the Constitution, 9th edition. And in this book, it talks about everything you would ever want to know about the Constitution. It goes into the background of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, Articles of Confederation, toward a more perfect union, the Constitutional Convention. It speaks about basic features, things like separation of powers and checks and balances, nature of judicial power, and then it outlines and talks in great detail about the Constitution itself, the preamble, the 7 articles, and then it goes into all of the Bill of Rights and all of the amendments, again in great detail. The original amendments, which were up through the 10th, the pre-Civil War amendments, of which there were 2, the Civil War amendments, of which there were 3, which brings us to 15, and then the 20th century amendments, which brings us up to 26. And at that point in time, the proposed amendment for equal rights and the proposed amendment for voting rights for the District of Columbia. And then there's a fairly extensive appendix. And when I saw this book in the bookstore, I thought, I'm an American. I was born and raised here. I have never really read the Constitution, and I have never really sat down and read the preamble, the amendments. As an American, I have an obligation to do this. So I sat down and I read the book, and I got a great education out of it. It was a good investment and a good move. This book doesn't just tell you what is in these documents and in these amendments and so on, but actually explains them. For example, on page 121, Amendment 1, Religion, Speech, Assembly, and Petition. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, speech, assembly, and petition. And the author explains, and I will just read part of this, I quote, "The First Amendment is directed specifically to Congress. The 14th Amendment, as now interpreted, imposes the same restrictions on the states. God is not mentioned in the Constitution, and the word religion occurs in only one other place, in the prohibition of any religious test as a qualification for office. The framers of the Constitution were not irreligious. Several of them came from states with established religions, but all probably agreed that religious matters should not fall to the jurisdiction of the national government. Some have argued that the Establishment Clause does not forbid governmental support for religion, but merely governmental favoritism towards a particular religion. The Supreme Court has rejected this construction. All levels of government must be completely neutral, aiding neither a particular religion nor all religions. Inside quote, a given law might not establish a state religion, but nevertheless be one respecting that end in the sense of being a step that could lead to such establishment and hence offend the First Amendment." And he goes on. The Establishment Clause is directed at 4 evils: sponsorship, financial support, active involvement of the sovereign in religious activity, and political divisiveness and fragmentation along religious lines. For a statute to survive a challenge that it violates the Establishment Clause, most especially if it sends out a warning signal by endangering political divisiveness along religious lines, it must meet a 3-part test. First, the statute must have a secular religious purpose. Second, it must have a primary effect that neither advances nor inhibits religion. And third, the statute and its administration must avoid excessive government entanglement with religion. And that's just the first 3 paragraphs of what is a small chapter in this book. So you can see there's a great deal of explanation in this book. It's not just here's what the amendment is. This is not something that I got in public school, and I don't think would have, because that kind of language right there, even with someone interpreting for you, I think is above a public school level of understanding and interpretation. So, to reel back a little bit, when I was in high school, about 1974 or maybe 1975, on my paper route, I happened upon an old shortwave radio that somebody had thrown out. Not one that you could transmit on, just one that you could receive on. And I brought it home, and with a little tinkering in the garage, I got it working, and a whole new world was opened up to me. I was all of a sudden listening to broadcasts in English from Great Britain, from Vietnam, from Brazil, just so many, Mexico, so many different countries, and I was amazed by this. And all of these stations would have announcements where they would say, if you write to us via airmail at this address, we will send you back information on our station. We will send you a letter. We will send you, I think it's called an SQM or SQL card, which is like proof of you're communicating with them. And so I started doing that, and I was thrilled to be getting airmail from places like Great Britain and Japan and Chile, and so on. And one of the places I sent off to was Radio Moscow. And the day that I received my airmail from Radio Moscow, my mother happened to intercept the mail that day, and she was absolutely aghast. And I got a major lecture about it. You got to remember, at this point in time, we were in the middle of the Cold War. There were a lot of fears. The Russians were going to bomb us, nuclear winter, World War III, the end of the world knocking on our doorstep. At this point in school, we were still having the air raid drills where you were either hiding under desks or you were lined up sitting in hallways with your head between your knees. So a lot of people were very scared. And the fact that I got this mail scared my parents, and all sorts of scenarios were called up to me, the worst of which was that the FBI would start watching our house in secret, and that my mom and dad would be arrested and hauled off. So there was, at that time, and as I was growing up and through to the end of the Cold War and even to present day, this instilled thought that Russia and these other communist countries are the enemy, that any country that practices communism is the enemy, and they are very much against and very hateful towards any countries that have a democratic government and a democratic society. And this had been fueled by other things that had happened in history before that. Other totalitarian and dictatorial governments and our experience was with them, the worst of which, of course, being Nazi Germany in World War II, which was something that was going on when my mom was a kid. So there was that, and then fast forward to just about a month ago, and I was in a bookstore, and I was in a section of used classic books, and I happened upon a copy from 1955, paperback of the Communist Manifesto. And just like with the book on the Constitution, I thought, I am an American. The communists are, from our view, the enemy. They are bad people. They would very much like to see us done away with. They believe and preach to their people that democracy is evil and a very bad thing. And I thought, this book is supposed to be the guidebook, so I'm going to read this. I'm going to buy it and spend the $2 and read it and see what it is they say about how to become or how to be a good communist and all of these other things. And I was very surprised to find out that this book, almost all of it, which is titled inside Manifesto of the Communist Party, as a history of the politics and economics of Europe from pretty much the late 1700s through the late 1800s. And the entire slant of this part of the book is about the constant struggle between the bourgeoisie, which is meant to be the class of modern capitalists, the owners of means of social production and the employers of the wage laborer, and on the other side, the proletariat, which was the class of the wage laborers, have no means of production of their own and are reduced basically to selling their labor power in order to live. There are some people in between that are called petty bourgeoisie, which were groups of people that sprung up at times that were able to get a little wealth and gain a little bit of land by being able to make a go of their own small business through help from craft guilds and skilled labor guilds and unions and things of that like. But those were, through the years, pretty much crushed fairly quickly whenever they sprung up. So that's most of the book. The most interesting part to me, though, was the last chapter of this book is called The General Law of Capitalist Accumulation. And a lot of this is information that Marx took from two economists, Samuel Moore and Dr. E. Aveling. he had edited and published this part of the book by itself in 1886. And the whole premise of it is, and I'll read this quote, the first section is, the increased demand for labor power that accompanies accumulation, meaning accumulation of wealth, the composition of capital remaining the same. And the next section, 2, relative diminution of the variable part of capital simultaneously with the progress of accumulation and of the concentration that accompanies it. So this is all, it's not easy reading. It's very detailed. I mean, this is like the sort of subjects that if you were a business or economics major in college, you would take courses that cover this stuff, or if you were in corporate business management. This third section, progressive production of a relative surplus population or industrial reserve army. And to continue, there is, I believe, one more section here. I'm thumbing through while I'm talking. There's one more section, section 4, different forms of the relative surplus population, the general law of capitalistic accumulation. And in reading all this, reading slowly, and trying to understand everything that was said here, there was something that really struck me hard about what Marx was laying out and what he was talking about. And at this point I'll mention I've gone through the whole book. There's nothing in it about we are evil, or here's how you be a good communist, or here's how we're going to plan to destroy the democratic countries, or anything like that. So the thing that struck me about this is some of the things he talked about in that last section totally mirrored my experience in the corporate workplace about the last 6 or 7 years that I was in it. In this section of the book, Marx indicates that there is something in particular that happens when a capitalist venture ends up with too few workers. And in the book he says this, I quote, "The law of capitalist production that is at the bottom of the pretended natural law of population reduces itself simply to this: the correlation between accumulation of capital and rate of wages is nothing else than the correlation between the unpaid labor transformed into capital and the additional paid labor necessary for the setting in motion of this additional capital. It is therefore in no way a relation between two magnitudes, independent one of the other. On the one hand, the magnitude of the capital; on the other, the number of the laboring population. It is rather, at bottom, only the relation between the unpaid and paid labor of the same laboring population." If the quantity of unpaid labor supplied by the working class and accumulated by the capital class increases so rapidly that its conversion into capital requires an extraordinary addition of paid labor, then wages rise, and all other circumstances remaining equal, the unpaid labor diminishes in proportion. But as soon as this diminution touches the point at which the surplus labor that nourishes capital is no longer supplied in normal quantity, a reaction sets in. A smaller part of revenue is capitalized, accumulation lags, and the movement of rising wages receives a check. Now, what he is talking about here when he says unpaid labor, here is what he is alluding to, and this is what I saw in my workplace. Unpaid labor is simply this. You are paying a person so many dollars per hour to provide a certain function in production. And it's based on a certain productivity rate. Let's say it's that they make 10 widgets per hour. Well, if you have a labor shortage, you've got to lean on those workers to work faster. And when you get them to work faster, and they are now, let's say, making 15 widgets per hour instead of 10, the profit that comes off of those 5 widgets per hour extra, that is what's called a windfall. It's like free money in the bank, as long as that continues to happen. That's what he's talking about there, and when that's not happening, then you are forced to hire additional workers, which costs you more, and it affects your capital, and it affects your bottom line in a negative instead of a positive way. And what I saw in my workplace that it directly mirrors this is during my last 6 or 7 years, there were quite a few workers out of a staff of 120 who had been hired in the late 70s to very early 80s, and they all started retiring about the same time. About anywhere between 7 to 9% a year for each of those years, the numbers were dropping, so that by the time I left there, our staff of 120 was down to 75, 76, and the company was not hiring additional labor. They were pushing the labor that remained to work harder, to work above and beyond the production rates. And when this was not going to plan, they were backfilling positions with temporary labor who came in at a much cheaper rate. The full-timers, benefits aside, were making $23.50 an hour, and these temporary workers were making about $12 an hour. So for the people that were producing above the production rates, they were still getting a windfall to dump into additional capital to help the bottom line in terms of profits, And this continued and continued until the point in time I left. It was still happening. And this is exactly the kind of thing that Marx is talking about here as basically a corporate business strategy. Along with this, the company had employees working an awful lot of overtime. 10 to 12-hour days were the norm and not the exception. So in the way, the employees, the full-time employees saw a windfall through this also. And related to this, Marx says this, and I quote, "Under the conditions of accumulation supposed thus far, which conditions are those most favorable to the laborers, their relation of dependence upon capital takes on a form of endurable, or as Eden says, easy and liberal. Instead of becoming more intensive with the gross of capital, this relation of dependence only becomes more extensive. In other words, the sphere of capital's exploitation and rule merely extends with its own dimensions and the number of its subjects. A larger part of their own surplus product, meaning the employees, always increasing and continually transformed into additional capital, comes back to them in the shape of means of payment, in other words, wage increases, so that they can extend the circle of their enjoyments, can make some additions to their consumption, fund of clothes, furniture, and so on, and can lay by small reserve funds of money. But just as little as better clothing, food, and treatment, and larger peculium do away with the exploitation of the slave, so little do they set aside that of the wage worker. A rise in the price of labor as a consequence of accumulation of capital only means, in fact, that the length and weight of the gold chain the wage worker has already forged for himself allow of a relaxation of the tension of it. So, and that's exactly what I saw too. These employees, unfortunately, a lot of them used the overtime money they were getting to purchase or lease very expensive cars, buy larger homes, major purchases, things like that. And then all of a sudden, if for some reason, and it did happen at times, the overtime stopped or dried up, all of a sudden they were in panic mode and, just absolutely did not know what they were going to do. So that really struck a bell with me. And there is the whole talk of wages here. Marx says that, and I quote, "To put it mathematically, the rate of accumulation is the independent, not dependent variable. The rate of wages, the dependent, not the independent variable. Thus, when the industrial cycle is in the phase of crisis, a general fall in the price of commodities is expressed as a rise in the value of money. And in the phase of prosperity, a general rise in the price of commodities as a fall in the value of money." And it's exactly what we see, that he's not just making something up, pulling a rabbit out of a hat, talking in communist terms. we see the fall in the value of money in a recession. And he calls this the currency school and says, again, I quote, the so-called currency school from this, that with the high prices too little, with low prices too much money is in circulation. Their ignorance and complete misunderstanding of facts are worthily paralleled by the economists who interpreted the above phenomena of accumulation by saying that there are now too few, now too many wage laborers. And again, we see this in our own economy. Too much money around when prices are too low, in effect. Too little when prices are high. So this is, again, not stuff that he's coming at from a communist slant. This is very educated analysis of how economics work in a capitalist society, which is what we are and a lot of other countries in Europe, and a lot of other countries in Europe were at the time that he and Engels wrote this manifesto. So, bottom line, it's very interesting in terms of today. It's got a lot of good information in it, and especially if you like history, the history of Europe. And there's nothing, as I said, in this book that is negative against democratic countries or governments. There's nothing in it about, gee, here's our plan to destroy the Western world or anything like that. So I guess my final message here is, if you as a citizen, you as an American see a book and you think, gee, I don't know enough about that, or I've never really explored that, it can be a real eye-opener to do so, and I encourage you to do so. So until next week's podcast, I am Don Kloss signing off. Thank you very much for listening.